Welcome to the recorded version of the Grantmakers and Aging web seminar, The Sequester, What 8% Cuts Would Mean for Aging Programs, featuring Howard Bedlin, Vice President of Public Policy and Advocacy at the National Council on Aging, Marci Phillips, Director of Public Policy and Advocacy at the National Council on Aging, Nancy Zweibel, Senior Program Officer at the Retirement Research Foundation, and John Feather, CEO of Grantmakers and Aging, from December 5th, 2012. This event was made possible by a partnership between Grantmakers and Aging and the John A. Hartford Foundation. Technical and production support is provided by the American Society on Aging.
Thanks, Steve. And I would like to add my welcome to this special Conversations with GIA. This is part of our continuing series on important topics of interest to funders in aging. Today's session is entitled The Sequester, What 8% Automatic Cuts Would Mean for Aging Programs. I'm happy that so many of you have joined us today for this critical and timely discussion. Before we begin, I want to thank the John A. Hartford Foundation of New York for their continuing support in making today's webinar available free of charge to funders in aging. We also want to thank the expert team at the American Society on Aging for providing technical and production support for the series. Today's conversation with GIA is in the headlines everywhere right now. Is the United States about to go over a fiscal cliff? What is a sequester? And most important to our audience, how does this all affect programs that benefit older persons? We are grateful to have nationally recognized experts to help us better understand this complex issue. Howard Bedlin is Vice President for Public Policy and Advocacy at the National Council on Aging. Marci Phillips is Director of Public Policy and Advocacy, also at NCOA. And Nancy Zweibel is Senior Program Officer with the Retirement Research Foundation, who will be bringing us the perspective of how funders can respond in their local communities. Howard, let's begin with you. We're at a very busy time here in Washington. What is coming before the end of the year?
Well, thank you, John. We are now in the midst of what is commonly referred to as a lame duck session. After the elections, Congress returns to finish up some business that they didn't finish during their regular session, and you have a lot of folks, about 85 or so, who are either retiring or who lost or moving from one place to another, like the House to the Senate, who are still here. So they're kind of lame ducks. And it's probably going to last until the end of the year. And they've got a lot on their plates. I've been doing this now for about 30 years, and I have never seen a lame duck session with so many deadlines and items of business that they need to accomplish before the end of the year. The slide articulates what's going to happen if they do nothing. What we're going to be talking about today, a sequester, which would happen January 2nd, that would be across-the-board cuts to discretionary programs that we're going to get into more detail on. In addition, the so-called Bush tax cuts from 2001 and 2003 expire at the end of this year. That's where we see all the controversy about whether or not the income tax cuts for those above $250,000 in income will be expiring or not, which is a bone of significant contention. As we've seen in previous years, there is an issue regarding how Medicare pays for doctors. And because of the funding formula, each year we kind of come back and make sure that the payment rates are not cut significantly. It's commonly referred to as the doc fix. And if nothing happens this year, there'll be about a 27.5% cut to physician payments, which is likely not to happen. It's never happened before. And what usually occurs is they kick the can down the road and extend it for a year. But that's very much on the table. We also have other tax issues. The payroll tax, which was reduced to provide stimulus, that reduction expires and would go up January 1st. Unemployment insurance extension is on the table. The alternative minimum tax, which is also something that occurs frequently, that affects a lot of middle-income Americans, expires, and is relatively non-controversial, but it just illustrates all the different things that Congress is being asked to do in just a few short weeks. So the sequester is a big part of that, and I think that's what we're going to get into in more detail today.
At this point, what's your best guess about what Congress may do?
Well, as we've said, there is this so-called fiscal cliff that occurs when all of these different provisions expire or kick in. And, the conventional wisdom is that it's going to be either a 2- or 3-step process. Some believe that they're not going to be able to reach any kind of an agreement before the end of the year, so they'll have a short-term bridge or down payment that will get them to February or March, and that's when they'll do at least the outline of a larger agreement, avoiding the cliff if they do this extension or bridge. Some think that we'll go over the cliff, or some like to call it sliding down the slope, and that the sequester will kick in, the tax cuts will expire, and that they'll fix it retroactively, probably early in the year in January or February, and that will provide a framework for longer-term deficit reduction without getting into all the details of exactly how you do tax reform or entitlement reform, which is another way of saying Medicare and Medicaid cuts for the most part. And then what will certainly happen is Congress will have, till the end of the year, the framework will provide instructions to committees with jurisdiction, and Congress will work through the normal committee structure to come up with the details of tax reform, the details of Medicare and Medicaid reform, et cetera. So it could be either a 2- or 3-step process. And as we mentioned, the physician payment issue, the so-called extenders package, which we do expect there will be action on before the end of the year, that will include at least hopefully a 1-year extension to avoid that cut to physician payments, as well as a few other items that are typically included in the package, like the issue, it's called QI, which stands for Qualified Individual Program, which is a low-income protection program that pays Medicare premiums for low-income seniors, expires at the end of the year and needs to be extended. Therapy caps, an issue that also expires and needs to be extended. Money for low-income outreach expires, needs to be extended. The issue there is going to be how to pay for it. It's about $25 billion for a year, but it's almost certain that that will be dealt with this year and not get delayed until January or February.
This kind of says it all, Howard. How did we get to this potentially terrible place?
Well, that's a longer story than is articulated in this slide. But, there is a lot that's happened over the past year. You may recall that we were faced with shutdown of government, and that was around the extension of the debt ceiling, which in the past had been somewhat routine. But this past summer became quite controversial because essentially Republicans wanted to have equivalent savings if they were going to extend the debt ceiling, and that ended up in a compromise referred to as the Budget Control Act that enabled us to avoid defaulting. And in that, there were caps placed on discretionary spending and a process by which these deficit reduction talks would move forward. So, for example, one of the provisions had to do with forming a so-called super committee that was supposed to try to come up with the grand bargain, and they failed to do that. And as a result, that's why we have these sequesters that are scheduled to take place, I believe it's January 2nd. But a lot of that came from this agreement that was reached in August under the Budget Control Act. In addition, we have, and we'll get into this, on the discretionary spending side, as it's known, we have normal appropriations where you have to fund the government as opposed to mandatory, which happens automatically, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But the appropriations process The fiscal year starts October 1st. We did not have a budget agreement by then. So what Congress did is pass what is quite common these days called the continuing resolution, or a CR, that essentially pays for things at the current levels for a certain period of time. And this was a 6-month CR, which is rather longer than usual. And that goes until the end of March. And that's by that time, they're going to have to come up with an agreement on, this is fiscal 13 budget and appropriations. And then they'll have to move pretty quickly to fiscal 14, recognizing again that technically the fiscal year started October 1st. So they're quite a bit delayed in terms of the normal appropriations process on the discretionary side. So a lot's happened that got us here, and it's quite potentially cataclysmic if nothing happens.
The cliff analogy is a reasonable one. Is all federal funding affected by this process?
Well, that's where we get into the difference between mandatory federal programs and discretionary programs. As we see from this chart, almost 2/3 of federal spending is in that mandatory category, and that's, for the most part, entitlement programs, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and some other mandatory programs, where Congress doesn't need to do anything, and they will continue. If Congress didn't pass a bill the entire year, those programs would continue. However, on the so-called discretionary side, that's where appropriations occur. And you have defense appropriations and non-defense appropriations. For purposes of the aging network, one of the 13 appropriations in the discretionary bucket is labor, health and human services, and education, where there are lots of different senior programs that we're going to be talking about. And that is exactly what is affected by the sequester. So we need to understand the difference between the mandatory side and the discretionary side. There are a few pieces on the mandatory side that are affected by the sequester that we'll talk about, particularly in Medicare, but it primarily affects the discretionary side.
Great. Before we move on to the next slide and to Marci, I want to remind everyone that the last section of the webinar will be answers to your questions. So please feel free to go ahead and start entering your questions in the box that's on your screen. If you click down to the questions section, you can go ahead and type those in, and I will be asking our speakers later in the session. So Marci, when you talk about spending that's discretionary, what do you mean? Howard's talked about this a little bit, but who decides what's discretionary?
Congress largely decides what's discretionary. It is the part of the budget that is subject to the annual appropriations process. So when Howard referred to the continuing resolution that funded a number of federal programs, these programs would not operate unless Congress allocated funding for them on an annual basis. And then you can see from this chart here that a large amount of discretionary funding is actually military or defense. The non-defense discretionary funding that we've been talking a lot about and which affects a large majority of aging services and health services are the non-defense discretionary or NDD programs, as we've been referring to them in shorthand. And it is notable that with all of these cuts that we hear are looming, if the sequester goes into effect, non-defense discretionary could potentially be reduced to 2.7% of the gross domestic product. Ratios of the gross domestic product are typically used to evaluate how much of a problem some of these budget issues are. And if they're growing out of control and take up too much of GDP, Congress and the administration and others really feel the need to step in. That 2.7% would be the lowest amount going back to the Eisenhower administration being spent on non-defense discretionary. So in essence, a lot of these programs are really not driving these larger debt and deficit problems that we are experiencing right now.
We are already talking about, and a lot of attention is being paid to the sequester. Could you talk a little bit more specifically about what the sequester actually is and what happens if that goes into effect more specifically?
Sure. As Howard had mentioned, this sequester is looming because Congress was not able to reach agreement on a larger deficit reduction package. So they are using the sequester to come up with $1.2 trillion in savings. That is being allocated equally by cutting defense and non-defense by $54.7 billion in just the first year. Most of the non-defense mandatory programs that Howard mentioned are not affected. Exceptions to that are cuts in Medicare payment to providers, but they could only be cut as much as 2%. There's a cap on that. Other mandatory programs that could be cut include the social services block grants that fund a number of services for older adults, for children, child welfare programs, adult protective services, even assist with Meals on Wheels, vocational rehab, student loans. In total, those mandatory programs could be cut as much as $16.2 billion in that first year. And in the first year of the sequester, cuts are levied across the board by an equal amount. They don't pick and choose that among valuable programs or less valuable programs. It's an across-the-board cut that affects all discretionary funding. And then in subsequent years, because this is a 10-year package, they're actually reducing the budget caps that have been put into effect.
You've already given us some sense of this, but what is the scale of the cuts we're talking about? And is the Administration for Community Living, which many of us still know as the Administration on Aging, also included in this process?
The scale really is for the non-defense discretionary. We would see programs cut by approximately 8.2%, and that's an estimate the administration's come up with so far. We've seen a lot of numbers being thrown around in the past couple of months, but it's typically averaged about 8%. There are different aspects of the sequester that would be affected by a different percentage. Defense has a different percentage. As we talked about the Medicare payments to providers, they would only see a 2% cut. But keep in mind, when it comes to the non-defense discretionary spending, these are cuts that are being made on top of $1.5 trillion that have already been cut over the past 2 years, largely from the Budget Control Act caps that we've talked about, but also just reductions that Congress enacted going from fiscal year 10 to fiscal year 2011. At the Administration on Aging, the Older Americans Act that they administer, as well as a number of other programs, the administration is estimating that they would lose $121 million in the first year alone.
Certainly very dramatic. Tell us a little bit about how you can translate those numbers to how they directly impact older persons who receive support from federal programs.
These numbers that we've come up with, we present on these slides, are largely estimates. One thing that we really do want to stress is that the Aging Services Network and a lot of other social services providers have been challenged in recent years and largely over the past decade to really scrimp to make sure that they can continue to provide services to their communities, to the most vulnerable in society. And so this 8.2% cut could really mean the difference between a program operating or not operating in certain communities. But in general, if we just look at the math, as many as 17 million fewer congregate and home-delivered meals could be delivered to older adults. Nearly 2 million fewer transportation rides for seniors to medical appointments, grocery shopping, and other needs that keep them independent in their own communities might be lost. Nearly 1.5 million people could lose personal care services such as in-home health with bathing and dressing. Again, those things that keep them independent and in their own homes and communities. About 6,400 fewer unemployed, low-income older adults would be able to be hired and paid because of cuts to the Senior Community Service Employment Program. And this in particular gives us a really good sense of what this really means to a community, because those older adults, as they provide services to their community through this program, actually provide 3.5 million fewer community services hours throughout the country, and that could mean nearly 900,000 fewer service hours for older adults alone. So ways in which these people in the CSEP program actually serve other older adults. But there could be 900,000 fewer hours serving older adults.
That's clearly not the end of the impact. What else is likely to happen?
These are just some other examples. We could have nearly 500,000 fewer seniors receiving very empowering health promotion and disease prevention services that allow them to manage their own chronic conditions, prevent falls, and improve wellness. Nearly 300,000 low-income senior households could lose assistance paying for their heat, their cooling, and their electricity without low-income home energy assistance program subsidies. 114,000 households receiving Section 202 housing for the elderly services, crucial to providing them with homes and supportive services, would lose out. 30,000 fewer volunteers would be able to meet the needs of their communities for youth, for older adults through the Senior Corps program.
What are the alternatives being considered, and how realistic do you think those might be?
Well, one of the examples that we are able to point to in terms of alternatives is the budget that the House of Representatives passed earlier this year for fiscal year 2013, commonly referred to as the Ryan budget. What this table shows is that non-defense discretionary funding is already slated for a large amount of cuts, both in terms of the BCA caps as well as the sequester that is planned. But while that is dire news for non-defense discretionary programs, the Ryan budget could potentially cut that aspect of the budget by nearly 27.5%. The other thing we have to point to is the proposal that Speaker Boehner offered as an alternative to what the President proposed last week for a budget agreement would cut discretionary funding by as much as $300 billion.
Howard, let's return back to you. Are there alternatives to these very dramatic and negative impacts?
Well, that's the question everyone in Washington is asking right now, and the focus of the negotiations and the back and forth that's taking place. You know, what can be done to avoid the sequester from biting and hitting? And I should say that the primary motivation is on the defense side. I think there's enormous concern on the part of both parties about the defense sequester hitting, probably politically even more so than the non-defense discretionary ones. And, you know, as Marci was saying, we now have President Obama, who is negotiating with Republicans in the House, led by Speaker Boehner. And President Obama came out with an initial outline of an offer last week, and House Republican leaders came up with a counteroffer this week. And, you know, the question is whether they can agree on a framework for a deficit reduction agreement that's probably in the vicinity of about $4 trillion over 10 years. So, you know, one scenario, as we mentioned, is a down payment or a bridge that permits them to continue to negotiate through February or March when they come up with that kind of framework. Or, you know, maybe they'll come up with the framework in the next few weeks. But the big differential right now has to do on the tax cuts side. This PowerPoint slide is a little bit out of date because Republicans now have agreed to put revenues on the table, but only about half as much as what President Obama had suggested. President Obama's proposal set about $1.6 trillion over 10 years. The Republican counteroffer was about $800 billion over 10 years. The biggest difference being whether to permit the tax cuts for the top 2% of incomes above $250,000 to expire. that continues to be a major point of contention. And Democrats have generally been unwilling to go along with the kinds of Medicare and Medicaid cuts that Republicans have requested unless there's some agreement on the revenue side. So those two are very much tied together and hotly debated. There are some that think the leverage that the Democrats will have will increase after we potentially go over the cliff, because then the tax cuts would have not been extended, and what would look like a tax increase this month will look like a tax decrease next month because of how the baseline declines. So some think that there are those who think the Democratic leverage will be greater, and it may be in their interest to try to get the deal in January. Both sides are very concerned about cutting defense. It does not appear that major Social Security reform is on the table, although folks may have seen that the issue that's referred to as the chained CPI, which is a fancy way of saying reducing the Social Security cost of living adjustment, is very much on the table. It is something that the House Republicans included in their counteroffer. It saves about $200 billion and affects some other programs other than Social Security. So that is in the mix. Also, there's an interesting view with regard to whether or not some of these Medicare reductions should apply to current beneficiaries or future beneficiaries and the baby boom generation. That's going to be an interesting question. But, right now, the focus in the press and the focus of what we're hearing from both sides is really around these income tax reductions for folks with incomes above $250,000. And that's been really hotly debated, and right now doesn't seem to be any quick resolution. So we'll see how that all plays out.
And we bring this section of our discussion to a close. I want to ask both of you, both Howard and Marci, a question, which is that, of course, the National Council on Aging is one of our leading advocacy voices in the aging community, and you've been very active in advocating. What are you telling people to do if they're concerned about this process? Howard, why don't we start with you?
Well, first we need to educate ourselves. This is a very complex area. We need to understand, the issues and the trade-offs involved so that we can, be effective voices expressing our concerns. And that's not easy because, frankly, in my view, the press doesn't do a great job. And if you just listen to the two parties, they have their own particular spin on it. So trying to find well-informed, trusted sources that will give you the pros and cons is a real challenge. And then, we're asking people to express their concerns about, how we should be resolving what is a serious problem in terms of our debt and our deficit, and how can we try to reach some bipartisan compromise. It's going to be very difficult, and there are going to be lots of different interests that are going to be engaged in this, and we encourage people to get engaged and express their views. In my particular view, senior programs are front and center for cuts of a magnitude that we may have never, ever seen before. So I'm very worried that senior programs may get disproportionately cut. So we are very much trying to educate folks and have them weigh in. And Marci can tell you a little bit more about one very important component, because I think we need to put a face on this and not just spew out statistics, which, lobbyists like myself might be good at, but actually talk about the human side and the stories of how these cuts may affect real people.
Marci?
So what we've heard from policymakers, from the administration to members of Congress, particularly those who are working with us on these fights, is that they do want that human face. They want that story of the individual senior who's going to be affected by any of these looming cuts. so I just wanted to share with you some resources that NCOA has that you can use to help contribute stories if you're so inclined, or to encourage others that you work with to participate. The link in particular I want to call your attention to is to the Sequester Guide. For the past 6 weeks or so, we have been collecting stories with people that we communicate with on a regular basis in our newsletter, asking them to look at some of these individual programs that we've talked about today and the impact that's going to affect them, and tell us what is going to happen in their community, or in particular to a local senior, if these cuts go into effect. And what we want to do is then amplify that by pitching those to the media, by sharing them with those policymakers to help them really make a difference, and to have policymakers really understand the individuals that these big inside the Beltway conversations will have.
Well, thanks so much. Just a couple things to remind folks of is, one, here is the contact information for our colleagues at NCOA, and also that, as was mentioned in the beginning, we'd be happy to send the entire set of slides to anyone. Just send an email to info@asaging.org, asaging.org, and we'll send you the slides. There will be a recording of this made available. For those of you that are GIA members, you'll receive an automatic notification of that. For those of you who are not and would like to have access to that link, send an email to the same email address if you would. And a reminder to go ahead and start sending in your questions. I'm going to ask Nancy to come in and give us an important perspective on how funders can work on this issue at both a local and national level. Nancy, what do you think philanthropy should be doing to be involved, particularly local funders?
Well, I just want to start by saying, John, that all funders are different and have different sets of priorities and requirements set by their board. So what I've tried to do in my comments is reflect a range of different options so that groups can tailor the response to their own situation. And I guess I would categorize them into four headings that I'll go over in turn. The first is backfilling. The second is building nonprofit capacity in the aging sector. The third is convening. And the fourth is getting back to the comments of Howard and Marci, advocating. So starting with the backfilling, it's going to be very tempting and important, I think, for local grant makers to really reach out to nonprofits that are the forefront of service providers for low-income seniors, particularly those living in the community, and attempting to provide financial supports in a variety of ways that allow them to keep the doors open while the advocates have their opportunity to be heard to prevent or potentially, hopefully, restore some of the cuts in future years. But I think it's important for grant makers to be careful how they do that, to make sure that the organizations they're providing support for have contingency plans and a vision for how they're going to prioritize their service delivery in the face of these cuts. And I think, the target needs to be both the area agencies on aging, or as we like to call them, AAAs, and also the contracting nonprofits that many AAAs use as their conduits for service delivery. But I think another way we can provide funding at the local level is by helping the nonprofits build their capacity. These agencies are already struggling, as Marci or Howard mentioned, and they're going to need to continue to develop contingency plans as the sequester rolls out over the next 10 years. This isn't a one-year event. And so the nonprofits are going to need the time. They don't have much in the way of an administrative budget, and that administrative overhead is even threatened with this sequester. So they need planning grants. They need resources to help recruit, train, and deploy more volunteers. They'll need perhaps research for needs assessment or analyses that allow them to prioritize how they'll make any cuts that they may have to make. And finally, they need assistance in improving their ability to raise funds from non-government sources, and I think investments in their technology and infrastructure to enable them to become more efficient. I guess some grant makers have the opportunity to make matching grants. Now's an important time to take that tool out of the toolkit, particularly as you work to help nonprofits in the aging sector raise their fundraising capacity. I know we also all have administrative requirements we place on our grantees. I think it's important to think about ways to soften those requirements for the Aging Network grantees so that they spend less time on administrivia and more time doing their important work. Some funders may have the option to raise the overhead allowances that they have in their grants. I think that would be greatly appreciated. And similarly, some funders have the opportunity to make operating support grants. And if not now, I can't think of a better time for that.
How do you think, foundations traditionally have had a role as conveners, particularly for local service providers. How do you see this playing a role at this time?
Well, I think we've seen already over the last few years with the economic downturn, I know in Chicago and I'm guessing in other cities, there have been, not just in the aging field, but efforts to convene nonprofits to consolidate and share their back office functions. So creating, if not new nonprofits, then programs through which administrative billing, human resources, and those kinds of functions can be shared. There's been a move in aging for co-location so that agencies that may want to reduce their overhead might locate in a housing building, for example, or a clinic setting where they can streamline assessment processes, reducing rental cost and improving delivery at the same time. But I think our convening work needs to be done not just at the provider level, but at the system level as well. We've seen with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Community Partnerships projects, which are 10 years, 12 years old at this point, but some of them have survived and thrived quite well and provide good models for how clusters of agencies can come together and work collaboratively to create and extend efficiencies and improve the reach of their system at a systems level. And finally, I think, there may be some opportunities for unexpected partnerships and alliances. I know at RRF we've been doing a lot of funding in the area of housing and housing advocacy. A lot of people who live in low-income housing are older adults. There's also, important impact that these cuts will have on groups like grandparents raising grandchildren. So there may be alliances with child welfare agencies and the like that may enable each partner to go farther on less. And
how should advocacy work be a part of this process?
Well, some funders fund advocacy and some don't. At RRF, as any of you who are on the phone know, we are a strong advocate for advocacy. We have had a great return on investment, and I think ultimately, and I think this is what Howard and Marci were getting at, you're going to get, you can't backfill all of the cuts that are coming. Everybody will spend down and go out of business if we try to do that. And so, to the extent that you're a local funder, that advocacy has to be about pushing your local community providers to get the stories of their seniors out to representatives and senators from your state. There may also be impact of the cuts on state infrastructure that will cause state and perhaps local budgetary authorities to make administrative changes in eligibility requirements, particularly in block granted and other kinds of services. changing their own matches for federal dollars with respect to Medicaid or housing subsidies and so forth. So advocacy at the local level, perhaps by supporting policy wonks, to use the colloquial term, at the local university level to provide the data analysis for what effect those changes may have on older adults is worth looking at. Because, again, this is not a one-year thing. This is something that's going to be taking place over 10 years. And while it's frustrating that the timing is such that national advocacy in the short run may not be capable of offsetting the cuts, if we're looking at a situation where there's a framework that's put into effect in the next few weeks that will then enable the time for Congress to make the decisions about how they're going to manage the tax cuts and rewrite the tax code and so forth, there will be time for those advocacy efforts to bubble up from the local and state level to the federal level. So linking in with AARP and NCOA and the Leadership Council on Aging and all of those organizations by bringing and enabling your local constituents is how I would see this likely to work most effectively.
All right. What else can funders in aging do?
Well, I think, in the mid to long term, we're going to need some more policy research, particularly, we all understand as aging experts that you can't cut these vital community-based services without resulting in cost shifting. I was just looking at some data from 2009 put out by the Mathematical Policy Research Institute, and they actually surveyed Title III of the Older Americans Act participants. These are folks who get congregate meals, home-delivered meals, homemaker services, case management, and transportation services. And 87% of case management recipients reported that if they didn't receive the service, it was likely they might be in a nursing home. 99% of people receiving homemaker services, 91% of people on home-delivered meals, and 86% of recipients of transportation service. So research that can take those figures and actually compute the cost shifting that will result or that is going to result I think would be an important contribution for fending off future cuts. To the extent that it's possible, doing that in a comparative cost-benefit manner would probably be useful as well. And then I think it's important to underscore that, the infrastructure through which these services are delivered is already quite fragile, both at the Area Agency on Aging and nonprofit delivery level, but also at state units on aging. And so to the extent that local funders have the capacity to fund government entities, building their data infrastructure, enabling them to do state-level policy analysis, enabling them to consult with experts from other states that are farther along the pike on a particular issue than they are, so they can not spin their wheels and they can work more efficiently, I think would be also important. At RRF, we tend not to fund government entities, but we can fund fiscal agents or nonprofits that have that policymaking capacity and to work with our government agency partners. And finally, I think foundations that have expertise in aging can man and volunteer on statewide task forces and lend expertise ourselves. My colleague Mary O'Donnell, who's an expert in capacity building, myself with expertise in long-term care, and lots of you on the phone who have expertise in substantive areas. I think it's important for us to share what we know as broadly as we can and assist in that way.
Well, thanks very much to all of our panelists. We're now going to move to a few minutes of questions, and a number of you have already written in questions. Please continue to do so in the box that you find on your screen. But Marci, let me turn to you first, and this is a somewhat technical question, but several people asked it because the issue is that the federal budget started on October the 1st, but the sequester is expected to go into effect on January 2nd. So are we going to have a truncation of that period so that from the period from January to October, we're going to essentially double the sequester cuts, or does the sequester just start on January 1st no matter where we are in the budget year?
That's a really good question, and I wish we had a better answer. It took a lot of doing for us to get the 8% for non-defense discretionary estimate out of the administration, but in reality, because this is an unprecedented sequester that's kicking in the middle of the federal fiscal year, we don't have a really good sense of exactly how the math would work out, but it would work out to be a much larger cut for those programs that already saw money going out the door in this first quarter. So, it could be a double-digit cut for some programs that have already been spending from October to January. I think that some of the thinking is that this is the worst-case scenario, and so this will never go into effect, so we really haven't seen a lot of the number crunching on that. But I've heard estimates of cuts as much as 12 or 15% in programs because they already have been spending. Luckily for some social programs like employment and training, the Senior Community Service Employment Program, their program year actually doesn't kick in until later in the fiscal year, so they haven't been spending the money yet. But for those that really kick in on October 1, they could be hard hit.
Thanks. Howard, this is a question for you, and it's a question about why Social Security is involved in this conversation. You had talked about that Social Security is probably not as part of the sequester process itself, and it's obviously funded through a sort of quasi-insurance model, and the estimates are that it will be solvent for several decades. So why is Social Security being brought into this conversation at this point? Is this just an opportunity to look at potential reforms, or is there some part of the sequester that affects it directly?
Well, I have to separate the sequester, which does not affect Social Security directly. It affects the Social Security Administration, but not the program itself. Medicaid and Social Security are exempt from the sequester. The Social Security Administration, and we were just talking with the Deputy Commissioner this morning, would see an 8.2% cut, and that could have significant implications for their staff and their services, but the program itself would not be affected. Now, in this broader discussion about, the grand bargain and deficit reduction, neither President Obama nor the House Republicans included the kinds of broad Social Security reforms that we've seen in the past. That is going to be a separate process focusing on solvency. What we did see, however, is a focus just on the annual cost of living adjustment, which is very much on the table. It's a proposal called chain CPI. The COLA is based on a formula related to the Consumer Price Index, which is a market basket of goods, to see what the inflator is from year to year. It's a pretty technical issue, and some believe that this chain CPI may be a better indicator of the costs. However, the major flaw of even the current calculation is it doesn't really take into account healthcare expenses and the fact that healthcare costs are going up more rapidly than the rest of the economy. So, the entire aging network is pretty much opposed to this chain CPI idea, but it would achieve about $200 billion in savings, and it effectively would be just cutting the Social Security COLA, which over time would be an even greater bite on the incomes of some very vulnerable seniors who depend on Social Security.
Thanks. Nancy, this is a question for you, and it's a question about the fact that many of the providers of services and so forth through the AAAs and others are either governmental agencies directly or quasi-governmental agencies. And most of them have not historically had a relationship with foundations or other grant-making organizations. I know that here at GIA we're getting a lot more requests from, for example, local government agencies about how they can connect to local foundations. Is this something that you're seeing? And you already mentioned that obviously foundations are not going to replace government spending, but how do those two things fit together, and what advice would you give a local government that's looking to better connect with funders?
Well, I guess my response would be partnerships. I mean, in Chicago, I guess our experience is that many of our service delivery agents are not government entities, with the exception of the major AAA in the city, but they contract out a lot of their service delivery. So we haven't had that experience per se, but we have had funders come together and create pools of money to support human services, and that money can go to one partner that is a non-governmental entity and be shared then with others. And I guess in terms of accessing the funding community, it's important and incumbent on us to get the word out to those groups about regional affinity groups, the Donors Forum here in Chicago, and similar organizations that can take organizations that are not traditionally funded by foundations and teach them who's out there and what their missions are, and enable those kinds of connections. That's one of the primary benefits that RRF tries to offer to its grantees, is connecting them to other funding sources. So I think that's going to be an important role for all of us to be playing more.
Unfortunately, we only have time for one more fairly technical question, and I'll direct this to Marci. This was from the slides that had to do with the statistics on Title III programs. What was the source of that information? Who's providing the statistics on that you're providing here?
Is that for me?
I'm sorry, for Marci.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry.
Luckily, when it comes to the numbers of people affected, that came from research that the National Association of Area Agencies on Aging conducted, largely by polling their members.
Okay.
So I can't say that it's all that technical, and I'd be happy to put anybody in touch with N4A if they want more details about that.
Okay. Once again, to remind everyone, because this is a very complicated technical issue, if you have specific questions, we'd be happy to try to respond. Just send an email to info@asaging.org, asaging.org. Also for those of you that want to rebroadcast connection. So I'll end up our session today by asking each of our panelists to give us a very quick final thought about this. And Marci, I'll start with you.
Thanks. Well, I thank everybody for their time, and we do understand that this is a very complex topic, and I hope you will take advantage of posing any questions afterwards. But most importantly, we hope to continue to partner with you on these very challenging issues. We need really everyone's support to both get the word out and put the face on these stories, but also reach the policymakers and the media that'll really make a difference.
Howard?
2 quick points. We didn't really talk much about Medicare, but Medicare is very much in the crosshairs of these discussions. Keep in mind that a couple of years ago, Medicare was cut by $716 billion over 10 years. The Republican counteroffer is suggesting to cut it by almost another $600 billion. Medicare is in serious jeopardy, in my view. Secondly, many of you, I think Nancy referred to the Leadership Council of Aging Organizations. It is the national coalition of senior groups. We're the current chair. It's a rotating chair. The coalition has done a lot of work on a number of these issues. So if you're interested in seeing where there is some consensus among a lot of the different national senior groups, take a look at the website, which is www.lcao.org.
Nancy?
Well, I guess I would just say that, first of all, Howard took one of my reactions, which is Medicare. We just had a conversation with a potential applicant yesterday and heard the exact same story that Howard just communicated about Medicare being in the crosshairs. So, advocacy on that score will also be vitally important. I guess my advice to grant makers is to be proactive and not wait. Whether it's on the advocacy side or the organizational capacity building side or the planning side, the convening role, it has to happen now if it's going to make a difference. Because once there's initial set of cuts made, that door's open. And the wider we let that door open, the more that's going to flow out of it in future years. So I think since they're using this timeline of a framework and then cuts, we have a window of opportunity of 6 to 9 months, it sounds like, where we can jump in, and we should be jumping in with both feet.
I want to thank Howard Bedlin and Marci Phillips of the National Council on Aging, and Nancy Zweibel, the Senior Program Officer with the Retirement Research Foundation, for joining us today. Thank you all for everything you do to make life better for America's older adults. I also want to thank the John A. Hartford Foundation for their support of this program, as well as the American Society on Aging for their technical expertise. And finally, I want to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. Have a great day.